Welcome to Double Double 2 Stories by Aliachish. Today's story is about a Nazi general who begged Eisenhower for mercy and gone now. Now let me hand over to my assistant Bob.
My name is Bob. I'm Ilya's assistant, and today I'm going to tell you about the day a Nazi general begged for his life and learned that some crimes are beyond forgiveness. This is the story of General Anton Dostler, a man who thought his rank would protect him, a man who murdered 15 American soldiers in cold blood and then hid behind the excuse that every war criminal uses, "I was just following orders." And this is about General Dwight Eisenhower, who had to decide whether mercy or justice would define the post-war world. The decision Eisenhower made that day changed everything. December 1st, 1945. The location, a cold, muddy courtyard in Aversa, Italy. The war in Europe had been over for 6 months. Most German soldiers had surrendered and were waiting in camps to go home. The killing was supposed to be finished. But on this freezing morning, one final act of violence remained. Tied to a wooden post, breathing heavily in the cold air, stood a man in a gray Wehrmacht uniform. He was not a private. He was not a sergeant. He was a general of the infantry. A man who had commanded tens of thousands of troops, a man who believed he was untouchable. His name was General Anton Dostler. Just days earlier, this man had been begging for his life. He had pleaded with the American Military Tribunal. He had sent desperate appeals all the way to the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. His defense was simple. It was the same excuse every Nazi officer used when the war turned against them. "I was just following orders." He believed that because he was a general, the Americans would treat him with respect. He believed that Eisenhower, a man known for his diplomacy and calmness, would spare him. He thought that generals did not execute other generals. He was wrong. Eisenhower sat at his desk, read the plea for mercy, and without a moment of hesitation, he stamped it. Denied. There would be no prison cell. There would be no comfortable retirement. There would be no mercy. The order was sent down the line, "Execute him." As the 12 American marksmen raised their rifles in the courtyard, General Dostler looked out from under his black hood. He finally realized the truth. The Americans were not playing by the old rules anymore. But to understand why Eisenhower refused to spare this man, we need to go back. We need to understand the crime that sealed Dostler's fate. And it begins with 15 young Americans on a mission deep behind enemy lines. March 1944. The Allied invasion of Italy was grinding forward. The Germans had turned every mountain, every river, every town into a fortress. Supplies flowing to the German front lines kept their defense strong. If the Allies could cut those supply lines, the German position would collapse. That's where Operation Ginny 2 came in. 15 American soldiers were selected for a secret mission. They were not regular infantry. They were members of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. These were America's commandos, specially trained, volunteers for the most dangerous missions. Their objective, infiltrate behind German lines and destroy the Fremura railway tunnel on the Italian coast. This tunnel was a vital link in the German supply chain. Trains carrying ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements passed through it daily. Destroying it would cripple German logistics for weeks. The 15 men knew the risks. They would be dropped by boat on a hostile shore, hike through enemy-controlled mountains, plant explosives on a heavily guarded target, and then escape back to Allied lines. The odds of survival were not good, but these were the kind of men who volunteered for missions like this. They knew what was at stake. The team leader was Lieutenant Victor Travers, a tough, experienced officer. Under his command were 14 other soldiers, young men in their 20s from towns across America. Sergeants, corporals, privates, men with families back home who had no idea where their sons were or what they were doing. All 15 wore full U.S. Army uniforms. This was critical. Under the laws of war, the Geneva Convention, soldiers in uniform captured behind enemy lines were to be treated as prisoners of war. They were entitled to food, shelter, and safety until the war ended on the night of March 22, 1944. The 15 Americans boarded a small boat on the coast of Corsica. They crossed the dark Mediterranean waters and landed on the Italian shore near the town of Stazione di Framura. The insertion went smoothly. They moved inland under cover of darkness, heading toward the railway tunnel. But then everything went wrong. Italian fascist soldiers patrolling the area spotted the Americans. A firefight erupted. The Americans were outnumbered and caught in the open. They fought as long as they could, but the situation was hopeless. Rather than die in a pointless last stand, Lieutenant Travers made the decision to surrender. The 15 men laid down their weapons and raised their hands. They were prisoners of war. The Italian fascists took them into custody and immediately notified the German command. The Americans were marched to a nearby German headquarters and handed over to the Wehrmacht. The German unit in control of that area was the 75th Army Corps, commanded by General Anton Dostler. When Dostler received word that 15 American commandos had been captured, he faced a choice. He could follow the Geneva Convention and treat them as prisoners of war, or he could follow a secret order from Adolf Hitler. In October 1942, Hitler had issued a directive known as the Kommandobefehl, the Commando Order. This order stated that any Allied commandos found behind German lines, even if they were in uniform, even if they had surrendered, were to be executed immediately. No trial, no mercy, just execution. Hitler's reasoning was that commando operations, sabotage missions, and raids deep behind enemy lines were dishonorable forms of warfare. He wanted to deter the Allies from conducting such missions by making it clear that captured commandos would not be treated as prisoners of war. They would be treated as criminals and shot. The commando order was illegal. It violated the Geneva Convention. It was a war crime to execute uniformed soldiers who had surrendered. Many German officers knew this. Some refused to obey the order, but others, like Anton Dostler, saw it as an opportunity to prove their loyalty to the Führer. When Dostler's staff informed him that the 15 Americans were commandos captured on a sabotage mission, he knew exactly what Hitler's order demanded. One of his subordinates, a German officer with some sense of morality left, approached him and said, "General, these are American soldiers. They were in uniform. They surrendered. If we shoot them, it is a war crime." Dostler didn't listen. He wanted to prove his loyalty to Hitler. He slammed his fist on the desk and ordered the execution to proceed immediately. There was no trial. There was no investigation. There was no communication with higher authorities to confirm the order. Dostler simply decided that these 15 Americans would die. On March 26, 1944, Just 4 days after their capture, the 15 American soldiers were taken to a rocky cliff near the town of La Spezia, overlooking the sea. They were not allowed to write letters to their families. They were not given a chance to say goodbye. They were lined up against the rocks. A German firing squad raised their rifles. The order was given. The 15 Americans were gunned down in cold blood. Their bodies were dumped into a shallow pit and covered with rocks and dirt. The execution was kept secret. Dostler ordered his men not to speak of it. He thought the matter was closed. He thought no one would ever know. He went back to his duties, continued commanding his troops, and assumed that by the time the war ended, this incident would be forgotten. He was wrong. By the spring of 1945, the war had turned decisively against Germany. The Allies were pushing into Germany from the west. The Soviets were closing in from the east. The Nazi regime was collapsing, and as Allied forces advanced, they began to uncover the true horrors of the Third Reich. In April 1945, American troops liberated the Ohrdruf concentration camp in Germany. It was a small camp, a sub-camp of Buchenwald. But what the soldiers found there was beyond comprehension. Buildings filled with emaciated corpses, survivors who were little more than skeletons, evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, insisted on visiting the camp personally. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. When he arrived at Ohrdruf, he walked through the grounds in silence. He saw the piles of bodies. He saw the crematoria. He saw the survivors, barely alive, staring at him with hollow eyes. Witnesses said that Eisenhower turned pale. He clenched his jaw. For a long time, he could not speak. Finally, he said to the officers with him, "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." Before that moment, Eisenhower had fought the war as a military campaign. Defeat the enemy army, capture territory, win battles. But after seeing Ohrdruf, and then Buchenwald, and then Dachau, he understood that this war was not just about defeating Germany. It was about defeating an evil that had consumed an entire nation, an evil built on men who turned off their conscience, followed orders, and committed atrocities without hesitation. Eisenhower made a decision that day. He ordered that the concentration camps be photographed and filmed extensively. He wanted every detail documented. He wanted proof that could never be denied, and he made a promise to himself there would be justice. The men responsible for these crimes would be held accountable. No excuses, no mercy. When the war ended in May 1945, the hunt for war criminals began. Allied investigators fanned out across Germany and occupied Italy, searching for evidence of atrocities. In Italy, they heard rumors of American soldiers who had been executed in 1944. They followed the leads, they interviewed witnesses, and eventually they found the mass grave near La Spezia. The bodies of the 15 American commandos were exhumed. Forensic investigators confirmed that they had been shot execution style. The investigation traced the order back to General Anton Dostler. When confronted with the evidence, Dostler did not deny it. He admitted that he had ordered the execution. But he insisted that he was only following Hitler's commando order. He claimed he had no choice. Dostler was arrested and charged with war crimes. He was held in a comfortable cell, given American rations, and allowed to meet with his lawyers. At first, he seemed confident. He believed that as a general, he would be treated with a certain level of respect. He thought the Americans would understand that soldiers follow orders. He thought he would be debriefed, perhaps spend a few years in prison, and eventually be released. He had no idea that Eisenhower had seen the concentration camps. He had no idea that the rules had changed. The trial of General Anton Dostler began in Rome in October 1945. It was one of the first war crimes trials conducted by the United States. The courtroom was packed with journalists, military officers, and observers from around the world. Everyone wanted to see how the Americans would handle a case like this. Dostler sat in the defendant's chair, his arms crossed, his expression arrogant. He wore a simple suit, stripped of all military insignia. He looked annoyed, as if this entire proceeding was beneath him. His defense attorney stood and made the argument that would define war crimes trials for decades to come. General Dostler had no choice, the lawyer argued. He was a soldier in the German army. He received a direct order from the Führer himself. If he had disobeyed, he would have been court-martialed and executed. You cannot punish a man for obeying his superior. He was a victim of the Nazi system, just like everyone else. It was a dangerous argument. If the tribunal accepted it, then no German officer could ever be held accountable. Every war criminal could simply say, "Hitler made me do it." The entire concept of individual responsibility would collapse. The American prosecutors were prepared for this. They brought forward witnesses, survivors from the area who had seen the Americans being marched to the execution site, German soldiers who had been present and were willing to testify. The evidence was overwhelming. Dostler had ordered the execution. He had not been forced. He had not been threatened. He had made a choice. The lead prosecutor stood before the tribunal and delivered a statement that would echo through history. A soldier is only required to obey lawful orders, he said. An order to murder unarmed prisoners of war is illegal. It is a crime against humanity. General Dostler knew this. He had the authority to refuse. He had the moral duty to refuse. He chose murder. And now he must face the consequences. The trial lasted several weeks. Dostler's defense team tried everything. They argued that the commando order was a legitimate military directive. They argued that the 15 Americans were not entitled to prisoner of war protections because they were on a sabotage mission. They argued that in the fog of war, Dostler made a mistake. None of it worked. On October 12, 1945, the tribunal delivered its verdict. Guilty. The crime. Ordering the execution of 15 American prisoners of war in violation of the laws and customs of war. The sentence, death by firing squad. When Dostler heard the word death, the arrogance drained from his face. The reality of his situation hit him like a hammer. He was not going to a prison cell. He was not going to retire quietly. He was going to die. His lawyers immediately launched a desperate appeal. They sent telegrams to the highest levels of the Allied command. They argued that executing a German general would set a dangerous precedent. They begged for clemency. They asked that the sentence be commuted to life imprisonment. The appeal landed on the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. This was the moment of truth. Eisenhower could have shown mercy. It would have been the diplomatic thing to do. After all, the war was over. Germany was defeated. Many people believed it was time to move forward, to rebuild, to forgive. Sparing Dostler would have been a gesture of reconciliation, but Eisenhower was not thinking about diplomacy. He was thinking about the 15 American soldiers lined up against that cliff. He was thinking about their families, who had received telegrams informing them that their sons were missing in action, never knowing the full truth of how they died. He was thinking about the piles of bodies at Ohrdruf. He was thinking about every atrocity committed by men who later claimed they were just following orders. Eisenhower realized that if he spared Dostler, he would be sending a message that following orders was a valid excuse for murder. He would be telling future generations that rank and obedience could shield you from justice. He would be dishonoring every soldier who had died fighting the Nazis. Eisenhower picked up his pen. He did not call a meeting. He did not agonize over the decision. He wrote a single, devastating sentence on the appeal document. The escape of a general officer from the punishment of death when he has ordered the shooting of prisoners would be a mockery of justice. He signed it. The execution was confirmed. There would be no mercy. When Dostler received the news, he collapsed. The realization that he was actually going to die, that Eisenhower had refused to save him, broke him completely. He spent his final days in his cell alternating between rage and despair. He wrote letters to his family. He met with a chaplain, but there was no escape. The date was set. December 1st, 1945. The morning of December 1st was cold and gray. A heavy mist hung over the courtyard in Aversa. At 8 o'clock in the morning, General Anton Dostler was led out of his cell. He was still wearing his gray Wehrmacht general's uniform, but all insignia had been removed. His hands were bound behind his back. He walked slowly, flanked by American military police. He looked tired, defeated. The arrogance of the master race was gone. Now he was just a frightened old man about to die. He was marched to a wooden stake driven into the muddy ground in the center of the courtyard. 12 American soldiers stood in a line 20 paces away. They carried M1 Garand rifles. They were the executioners. A chaplain approached Dostler and murmured a short prayer. Dostler mumbled a response, barely audible. An American officer approached him with a black hood. Dostler flinched as the darkness descended over his head. For a moment, there was total silence in the courtyard. The only sound was the wind and the faint breathing of the witnesses standing at the edges of the space. In those final seconds under that hood, one wonders what went through Dostler's mind. Did he think about the 15 Americans he had ordered to be shot? Did he remember their faces? Or was he still telling himself that he was innocent, that he was a victim of circumstance? The officer in charge raised his hand. Ready. The 12 rifles snapped up in unison. Aim! 12 barrels focused on the white target pinned over Dostler's heart. Fire! A deafening volley cracked through the air. General Dostler's body jerked violently against the ropes. He slumped forward, lifeless. It was over in an instant. The first German general to be executed for war crimes was dead. The execution of Anton Dostler sent a shockwave through the remaining German military hierarchy. Until that moment, many of them believed they would get away with it. They thought the Americans were soft. They thought they could hide behind their rank and their orders. Eisenhower proved them wrong. The decision to execute Dostler established a principle that would guide the Nuremberg trials and every war crimes tribunal that followed. You cannot hide behind orders. You cannot claim that your rank absolves you of moral responsibility. When you cross the line of humanity, when you murder the defenseless, There is no excuse that will save you. Eisenhower's decision was not about revenge. It was about justice. It was about drawing a line in history and saying, this far and no further. The excuse of I was just following orders died with Anton Dostler in that courtyard, and the world became a little bit safer because of it. General Dwight Eisenhower was a man of peace. He hated war. He hated unnecessary bloodshed, but he understood something fundamental. True peace requires justice, and sometimes justice requires a firing squad.